Good morning, everybody. I'm Giorgio, Hiatt, senior pastor here, and it's my privilege to continue in our second week of 1 Peter. It's a really weird thing to imagine preaching about a passage that includes the words inexpressible and invisible. It's hard to help us see something from this text when at its core is something invisible, and it's really hard to express something that is inexpressible. But this is like status quo for 1 Peter. He lives very comfortably in the mystery that is very strange about our faith, and yet teeming with hope and power and love and truth. So we enter today in what can only be called a strange rejoicing in this text. In this is our faith, in this you rejoice. You rejoice with joy inexpressible, filled with glory. And it all comes from the same sentence that starts way back earlier in verse 3, I think it is, maybe 2. Blessed be the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. A long sentence about rejoicing. Worship itself isn't strange, though. Sports and concerts remind us that we're all made for worship. We may suppress the truth that we're made for worship, but it doesn't make it less true. But what's strange in our rejoicing is this inexpressibility of it. And I want us to lean into that a little bit, because what I find so amazing about the Christian experience, about being with us in rejoicing, is I'm able to put into words sometimes what happens. I cannot tell you how many times that I've sat over there and been struggling with my own self, my own family, my own internal life, my own doubts and all that. And then I hear you worship. And something happens inexpressibly that actually forms me into that worship. It moves me to the same place, to value and honor and believe that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are rightly placed in our worship, in our rejoicing. But the weird thing in this passage isn't just that. It's not just inexpressible. It's inexpressibly strange because there's a rejoicing that happens within the Christian community. Another bizarre thing that is inexpressibly clear is that we rejoice amid suffering. How does one get an email like I got from Barbara and John McCoy this week? It says, "Thank you for praying and caring for us, especially during this last year." She goes on to talk about John having a trial procedure Monday to determine if a nerve stimulator would work. And if it does, that they'll be able to be put in later in the month. And they're praying for favorable results. And she talks about, since June, I've been taking an oral drug to inhibit my cancer growth. A recent lab report indicates it's working. We are praising God for this. And then she writes, this season of COVID, chronic pain, cancer, and quarantine have been difficult. How grateful we are for Redeemer and its leadership and the amazing worship services every Sunday, ! Thank you for serving the body during this crazy time. Love and capital Joy! Joy. Barbara and John McCoy. In suffering, Peter knows it's odd. He says, in this you rejoice through, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith may be found to result in the praise and glory and honor at the revealing or the revelation of Jesus Christ. We rejoice in suffering for a little while. Admittedly, those little whiles can feel a long while for many of us in our sense of time and space. But remember how Peter locates salvation into a future grace, one that lasts for eternity. So even several years of grief and trial pale in comparison to everlasting rejoicing. As one of Susan's mentors and pastors and colleagues said, this life, it's only for a lifetime. And I know that that can grate or rake on our ears. I know that getting ours now is the cultural norm for the day, but that's why we're strange, because we live with that not being our chief end. I know we live in a world that's all Christmas and no Advent, but it is precisely the Christian that understands that we wait, even in suffering, and can rejoice in it. Remember, these Christians that he's addressing have probably been kicked out of Rome for being a bunch of rabble-rousers, and then many others converted throughout the size of California, 2.5 Californias. They become, in some ways, the bottom of the rung socially, and that always includes being grieved by various trials. Do you remember 10 years ago in the devastating earthquake in Haiti? In an NPR report, it summarizes, for the Western Hemisphere's poorest country, the earthquake that hit Haiti was an especially cruel blow. Despite this, it's hard to find a Haitian who doesn't profess belief in a loving God. They sang. They don't have the prosperity or the health, but they have a song. Andy Crouch continues about this. He says, when you've lost everything, in fact, you still have a song. All over the hills of Haiti, those first terrible nights, under the starlit sky, the voices of the people of Haiti rose up in grief and lament and prayer and hope. That is strange rejoicing. But what is the purpose in this kind of suffering? Why does the Bible so unquestionably ask us to enter in and walk through suffering, trials, with rejoicing in our midst? Peter answers, because it's the tested genuineness of your faith, right? More precious than gold that perishes though it's tested by fire, may be found to be a result in praise and glory and honor at the revealing of Jesus. Peter says something that's kind of hard. He says, for the Christian, it is for our good. Because of the blood and work of Jesus, we have an imperishable faith, but that purification process is still going. He uses this image of gold and fire. He says your suffering is testing the genuineness of your faith, and it's also purifying the genuineness of your faith. It's a purifying gold metaphor. Some suffering is a fire in which the gold of your faith is purified. And when the temperature goes up, the fire burns off the dross and the impurities drip off. There's a refining and purifying trial. That's why it's necessary. Gold is precious, made more precious under fire. Our obedience, our life in Jesus is precious and is purified when it is refined by trials. And he says gold doesn't last forever, but this imperishable faith does last forever because it is in a God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Rejoice. Too often, David Osborne says, we try to use God to change our circumstances instead of realizing he's using our circumstances to change us. And this is it. This is where Christians become kind of beyond weird and strange and to stranger still, almost bizarre. That we, as Christians, grow in appreciation of his purifying fire. Appreciating the purification of our faith more than the pain we suffer. Please, let me say that again. We begin to appreciate the purification of our faith more than the pain we suffer. And we rejoice in valuing and appreciating and honoring that purification because of the purity it's producing in our faith. Now, let me be clear. Peter is not saying you're supposed to like it, that you're supposed to be giddy about it. Sometimes folks in our tradition who believe in the sovereignty of God, which we wholly affirm, it means that we can't call various trials bad or that there's some way we don't declare what the realities of suffering are. Cancer and COVID are not good. Death is awful. God wants us to hate it. It is our last enemy. It is an enemy, but it is our last enemy. It is a destroyed enemy, but it is our enemy. It's just that God uses this pain, this suffering, and death itself for our good. But do we value more the relief or the refining? Barbara McCoy wrote back to me when I asked her if I could use her email, and she wrote another email. And I had sent the verses to her from this passage just to encourage her. She wrote, "Just reading these verses evoked deep emotion as I reflected on almost 4 years since my stage 4 ovarian cancer diagnosis. John and I know that God's mercy spared my life and has led me to a deeper, capital F-A-I-T-H faith than I could ever imagine. The valuable lesson I have learned through suffering: I am not in control. God is, and all caps, I can trust him, exclamation point, exclamation point." Do you see her valuing what the Lord is doing in her, the refining even more than the relief of the suffering? But it is not just that it is good for us. The tested faith is such that it is found in the result of revealing who Jesus is, the revelation of Jesus Christ. So it's not just about our good, but it's about his being revealed, his glory. This rejoicing begets rejoicing because the world will see Jesus in our rejoicing while we suffer. Jesus is revealed in our faith and hope amid suffering. Think about it, friends. We are not only just on this earth for a lifetime, a little while of suffering, and that not only is it that we're just already dead in him and alive in him, dead to ourselves and alive in him, but that strange rejoicing that we have, especially amid suffering, becomes a testimony to the living God. Strange rejoicing amid suffering is an evangelistic tool in the mighty hand of God who is strong to save. That is what's going on. And so it does beg the question of us, right? There is no question. There is fire. But the question is whether we are being burned by it only or being purified in it. And as one commentator says, that is not determined by the intensity of the heat, but by the malleability of our spirits in the hands of the goldsmith. So it begs that we must examine ourselves and our responses to the crucible of trial, of suffering, amid the pain, amid the isolation, amid the suffering of this world. It is a flame, but does it purify or simply burn? How would our neighbors describe us? My prayer is that I and we will be seen as people who have an unblinking courage to name the suffering as it is, and yet an unquenched faith that meets out in rejoicing because he's purifying us in the middle of the pain. All for our good and his glory. How does this happen? How can we, as those who are a chosen, exiled, and dispersed people, rejoice? Why does it happen? Why must we suffer for our good? C.S. Lewis quips, he says, the reason Christians are asked to suffer is because they're the only ones with the resources to handle it. We do, my friends, have a God who tasted suffering on our behalf. This motivation for strange rejoicing is because of love. Just like the strangeness of worship, though, is inexpressible, it's strange that for us, the something we love is unseen, or better, the someone we love is unseen. Though you have not seen him, you love him, Peter says. He levels it with us. He says you don't see something visible anymore. We have strange eyes to see things that are invisible. I don't know if you know who Gardner Calvin Taylor is. He is passed maybe a couple decades ago. He was called the Dean of American Preachers, a Baptist preacher in Brooklyn for 40 years, but for many, many years, even beyond those 40. When he was a young man in his 20s, he was preaching in Louisiana. This is not too far after the Depression, and electricity was kind of scarce. He was in a decent-sized church, but they only had one light bulb hanging from the middle of the sanctuary. It was an evening service. And in the middle of him getting grooving in his sermon, the electricity just went out, and the whole place went dark. And he fumbled and was unsure. He's a young preacher. It's pitch black. He didn't know what to say. He stumbled around with his delivery, and finally, an elderly deacon in the back of the church cried out, "Preach on, preacher, we can see Jesus in the dark." This is what is going on here. Don't let this be less strange than it is, especially when we're talking to our neighbors. Christians, I believe in the power of an invisible God, a supreme spiritual being. And in all but about 30 years of life, in a few rare times, he has not been seen by the people who worship him. Neighbors, those of you who don't believe, we admit it, guilty as charged. It's strange. We believe in an invisible God that is full of power and love. Guilty as charged, Peter says. But I started reading about invisibility, and I went down the rabbit hole into a National Geographic article that only 5% of the matter in the universe is actually visible. 25% is called dark matter, and you can't see it. The other 70% is called dark energy. I don't know why the difference in naming. I say this only to say, though, that invisibility is not evidence of non-reality. We see the evidence of invisible reality all around us without seeing the reality of itself. 90%, 95% of the universe. So what Peter does is he orients us to this invisible God and said, God is seen in the love. It's like invisible wind manifests is seen in the blowing trees. The invisible God is seen, to use Peter's language, revealed at the day of Jesus in our love for him. Please hear these words. Though you love him, you have not seen him. So though you have not seen him, you love him. Don't gloss over that. Don't fly by that verse. We are used to, and rightly so, used to speaking effusively about the great grace and love that comes from God. And we'll do it here in the sermon in just a bit. But do we realize that actually loving Jesus is at the center of the purification of our lives, our rejoicings amid suffering? The great purification, the great renovation project includes a change of our hearts, minds, bodies, actions, wills, affections toward loving Jesus. I don't know if you know of another theologian who's alive, but was more famous probably a couple decades ago. His name is Tony Campolo. He's kind of a Peter-like, Martin Luther-like figure, bombastic theologian. A pastor friend had to pick him up in seminary at the time, when he was in seminary at the time, for a conference. And this is when you could meet somebody at the gate. And the first words out of Tony Campolo's mouth to my friend were, "Do you love Jesus?" And my friend said, "Oh, I know that Jesus loves me." He goes, "I didn't ask you that, son. Do you love Jesus?" And my friend, taken a bit aback, says, Yes, I do." It made a huge impact him to orienting what is not just the receiving of the love, but the giving of the love back to Jesus. And here's the deal. Our strange rejoicing, our ability to endure and even worship amid the suffering is born from our love of Jesus, our love for Jesus. It's universally true that the people and beliefs we most sacrifice for are people or beliefs that we love. I have no desire to sacrifice, eat a little less or exercise a little more for regular M&Ms. Peanut M&Ms? That's a different story. My dad used to say, "I run so I can eat ice cream." He loved ice cream. But seriously, isn't it ultimately love of others that had the NYPD and the New York firefighters run into a burning building? Isn't it love that we endure jobs and sacrifice resources and dote on the accomplishments of our children? Isn't that born of love? Isn't it love for God that produces the strange rejoicing? It's all born of love. And please don't let the cynical side of all of us rush toward an anti-cheesiness posture. Answer the question that Tony Campolo asks: do you love Jesus? I'm asking you because it haunts me too. mind, body, soul, allegiances, affections, and actions, do I love Jesus? And Peter gets this, maybe more than anybody who ever lived and interacted with Jesus, because Jesus asked this very question of him. Before the crucifixion, Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and when eventually they were able to meet and see each other again, Jesus asked him 3 times, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" Almost offended, Peter was like, "Yes." But think, Jesus didn't ask, "Have you grasped how much I love you now? Have you intellectually acknowledged your indebtedness to my sacrifice?" He didn't even ask him what he believed about what has just happened in the last few days. He simply asked Peter, "Do you love me?" And when he answered, "Yes," Jesus said, "Feed my lambs, care for my sheep, feed my sheep." And so the matrix, the evaluative tool for discerning our love of Jesus is not just the measuring of our affections and our rejoicing in suffering, though that is a part. It is a measuring of care and hospitality for the people of God. John says something similar in a little bit harsher way. He says, "If you say you love me and hate your brothers, you're a liar and the truth is not in you." Jesus adds even more, "If you love me, you keep my commands." That is the measure of love. Our obedience and affection to Jesus proves the object of that affection. We have so many completing loyalties in us, so many things clamoring for our desires, our longings, our hopes, our valuing. So many things that want to become the object of our loves, of our rejoicing, of our valuing, things that we end up obeying instead of Jesus. And you know them. It is anything you do or think or I do or think or feel that tries to remove or replace Jesus from the center of our love and obedience. Because anything we love more than Jesus becomes the thing that we'll actually sacrifice our lives for, endure under, suffer for. And it can be money or power, influence, control, comfort, pleasure, being right, any of it. We will suffer for these things instead of suffer in rejoicing where the only object of our affection is rightly placed in the triune God, the only one that can take the weight of such worship. So if you're like me, what do? Ask the question, do you love Jesus? And all I could answer is, yes, but nowhere near enough. I need more love for you, Jesus. Please bring me more rejoicing amid suffering, more strange rejoicing. Make me stranger still. Make me love you more. And that's where our strange rejoicing emerges. Because the love that Peter talks about in his life and letters is not just a love for God, but a love from God. Our strange rejoicing emerges from our love for Jesus. But that love for Jesus emerges from the love from Jesus. Let me say it again. Our strange rejoicing emerges from our love for Jesus. But that love for Jesus comes from the love from Jesus. Though you do not see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Believing in Jesus is believing in him and his redemptive work for us. I find it so amazing that Peter would honor all who have not seen Jesus. He's writing some maybe 30, 40 years after, maybe 25, 35 years. My math's not good right now. After Jesus has already died and risen and ascended into heaven. So he's talking to people who have not necessarily seen Jesus, both geographically or chronologically. And he looks at those people and he says, you haven't seen him, but you love him. But you love him because he first loved us. His friend John said it in so many words. We love because he first loved us. I want you to think about Peter's life for a little bit. Jesus called him by name and out of a vocation as a fisherman. And he asked him to become a fisher of men. And Peter, when he first met Jesus, was like, couldn't comprehend Jesus' love. He says, "Depart from me. I'm a sinful man." And within either minutes or hours or something in that day, he ends up leaving his boats behind and following the one that loved him. Jesus, not too long after that, goes to Peter's mother-in-law's house, and he heals her from a spiking fever, and then goes out to the porch and starts healing others as well. And Jesus is going, and Peter's going, look at Jesus' love. Jesus beckoned Peter forth to walk on water to greet him. And he did. It worked. Of course, until he took his eyes off Jesus, the one who loved him. Jesus taught Peter that forgiveness was not just something you did 7 times, but 7 times 70. The mind-blowing reality of the love that is from God. Jesus revealed to Peter and only 2 other peoples the glorious Hesed love, the covenants all making sense at the Transfiguration. Jesus rebuked Peter in love when he said that Jesus wouldn't die. And then just minutes later, Jesus confirmed Peter in love when Peter proclaimed that Jesus was Messiah, saying, "On this rock, this Petros, I will build my church." Jesus is the one who reminded Peter of God's cleansing love when Peter was like, "No, you can't wash my feet." And Jesus goes, you have no part of me if I can't wash your feet." And Peter goes, "Okay, wash it all then." He started to understand Jesus' love for him. Jesus is the one who healed Malchus's ear. After Peter, forgetting that the love of God, the love from God includes a love that makes us love our enemies and his enemies, when Peter chops off Malchus's ear and Jesus lovingly heals him. And then, as we talked about it before, when Peter was denying him, Jesus loved him. And when Jesus was no longer there, and Peter walked into the empty tomb and just saw linens, he saw the love from God, the glory of the resurrected one. And a few days later, it was Jesus that Peter dove out into the water in when he saw Jesus on the shore, because he knew of this great love. And it was Jesus who restored Peter by asking those questions about love 3 times over burning coal fire and broken bread and some good fish that was just caught miraculously. It was Jesus' gospel who leapt from Peter's lips after Pentecost, or at Pentecost, when Peter declared the love of God to the whole world. And it is the love from Jesus that Peter so eloquently writes about and has lives out and calls us to the same in inexpressible ways through suffering for our good, for his glory. A strange rejoicing. Our strong rejoicings reveals Jesus as we love him because he first loved us. Let's pray. Jesus, we thank you for your kindness. We thank you for your love. Help us love you more so that we would value you so much that our loyalty, our obedience, our affections for you would be the most visible thing in the world, especially as we're refined by the fires and trials of this world that you bring